I'd like to make a couple of observations. Now, this won't affect people's assignments because they're already in and I'm well into marking them. But there are a couple of things that have come up which I thought would be useful to show people that, as I say, could help you in the future. One of the first things, when you do rural valuation, you're working on typically large blocks of land. And this means we come across a common problem which is particularly relevant, I guess, for surveyors. When surveyors define the land, that is, they subdivide it out, they're responsible for actually allocating where all the boundaries are and so on. And they also measure the area. And so the areas that we have come from surveyors doing their cadasteral plans, deposited plans in New South Wales, registered plans in Queensland, and different names in other states. But they're the plans that give us our actual definitions of the land that we own in our certificates of title. Okay, so far so good. When a surveyor measures area, he calculates it as a result of all of his distances and so on. The surveyor is working actually to about 1 part in 100,000. So that's very, very precise. But when they come down to quoting area, they quote it to 4 significant figures. And I want to demonstrate that in this particular example. It's not taken from anywhere in particular. It's just an example of a report that was written. Okay. We have a parcel which is made up of 3 lots. 202.00 hectares. Well, is that really 00 hectares? No, it's not. Because in the surveying plan, the deposited plan, it would show that area as 202.0 hectares. It would not show it with the second significant figure. The reason for that is that surveyor's working to 4 significant figures. The 2020, that's 4 digits. Okay. The fourth, the extra 0 down there, actually doesn't come into this particular deposited plan for lot 411. When you come to the smaller lot down here, lot 11, actually on the same plan, you'll notice it's a smaller lot. It's only 54 hectares. In fact, it's 54.84 hectares. Notice here, 4 significant figures. A 5, a 4, an 8, and another 4. That's 4 significant figures. And we'll carry on. Lot 12, same deposited plan, 194.90. Well, it's actually 194.9. Now, surveyor doesn't actually specify that, but you have to read into the various surveying acts in the different states to actually find that what's going on there, that last 0, has been put in by a lawyer or a property economist or an accountant or who knows whom, but somebody who doesn't understand that the surveyors only work to 4 significant figures. Why am I rabbiting on about this? Because when you add them all up, you appear to suddenly have 5 significant figures. Okay. Now, is the last digit in there significant? Well, it isn't, because the 202 hectares could be 202.03 or 201.97. Both of those round to 202 hectares exactly. Oh, sorry, 97. Right. In other words, errors in that second significant figures aren't simply there. Realistically, it's very hard to survey boundaries to millimetre precision. Surveyors actually measure typically to that sort of precision, or at least a few millimetres. But by the time you run lines over hundreds of metres, then that adds up to a fair bit of area where we simply don't know where it is. Okay, what am I saying here? That the 0.04 hectares, which is reasonably understandable in lot 11, by the time it's added to these other blocks of land to give this parcel, we don't know really whether it's 451.68, 70, 77, whatever. This last significant figure is meaningless as long as it approximates to 451.7, and that's about as accurate as we go. Realistically, it's not going to make a lot of difference to value either. We're talking in this case to a tiny amount of land compared to the whole paddock. You know, if you've got 1,000 hectares or something, then you know, we're only talking about probably an area about the size of, you know, probably, you know, somebody's suburban backyard, which is nothing on a reasonable sized property. Okay, I mention this because as you go through your professional careers, and regardless of what you're doing, if you are dealing with large lumps of land, especially when they come as a parcel of several lots, be very wary not to fall into the trap of attributing greater precision to the land than is actually there. Okay, that's a very common problem. I do encounter it a number of times, and it's worth making a note of it because as a professional, we've got to be discreet not to claim too much. We are doing this to demonstrate a certain amount of cleverness, shall we say, to do with land value. If we go around stating things which are beyond our competence to state, then we're making ourselves look a little tiny bit silly. And while this is very common, especially with the use of this information by people that are sort of too far away, shall we say, from the engineering and mathematical sciences, you know, it is common, but it still doesn't look like you've done your homework. So I just do recommend that you avoid it where you can once you understand what's going on. 4 significant figures, very unlikely that surveyors will ever put areas to higher accuracy, certainly for what we call cadastral purposes, in other words, land boundary purposes. If a surveyor is measuring something, say, on a building site or for some other particular process, yes, they might work to considerably more accuracy than that, but certainly not for boundary definition. I'd like to move now to talking about another extremely common mistake which is made. There are a number of places where we use words that are nice and fancy and sound learned and all the rest of it, but in fact they're the wrong words. And despite lots of people using them because they are fancy, when they do, they display that they're not as smart as they would like everyone to believe. And for this reason, I'd like to encourage people to give thought to this as you move through with your professional lives and so on, and your education, by getting your terms more appropriate. One of the common ones that you'll find all over the place in academia is the misuse of the word methodology. Methodology is the study of how to decide, or way of decision, on a particular way of doing something, a particular method. And so in this case, we have a very nice appendix added to a report, which is a methodological statement, and a statement of why one method is better than another. In this case, we're talking about the comparable transaction method, rather than perhaps a different method, such as the cost approach or whatever. There are many methods that you can use to do a valuation. And so to decide which one you're going to use is when you sit back at the beginning of the task and say, will I do this method or that method? And you give reasons, and that's actually a scientific investigation. Science is certain knowledge through cause. Here we're trying to work out which method, and so we do methodological deliberation, and we argue why we choose this method over that method. That's methodology. The methods we choose are not methodologies, they are methods. And it's useful, probably more precise, especially if you want to look seriously educated or intelligent, not to use the fancy word which demonstrates you don't know what you're talking about, even though lots of people are doing that. but use the precise word. It's a little bit more, shall we say, humble, but it does reflect a deeper education. And so I would encourage you to consider doing that. Hear this comment, and I'm writing a number of comments like this as I go through, explains this in detail. We're not concerned with whose approach this related to, whose report, simply that it's a common problem. And unfortunately, you will find, even in academic texts and perhaps in places in Moodle, and even professors kind of using these words in a mixed up way. But now you'll be able to spot when they use that. While we're talking about particular choices of words, there are a number of others that we find very commonly used today, which are either very novel and look impressive and complicated and so on, but in fact are simply synonymous. In other words, they have exactly the same meaning as a better known, perhaps more familiar word. And why do we choose the complicated novel word? Again, it is often because we're only poorly educated and we want to look better educated than we really are. And so we use these fancy newfangled words or what have you. In some cases you may want to do that, but in most cases it just looks like, well, you're a young upstart, you really don't know what you're talking about, and you're just using these fancy new words to show off in a way which doesn't really show that you're sort of deeply immersed in the English language. One word that does come to mind in that category is the word create. Now, create is a lovely, lovely word, but it means to make something out of nothing. It's actually very hard for human beings to do that, because usually we use raw materials and we use the designs or what have you, or the ideas that we take for others. So usually we make things, we don't actually create them out of nothing. Perhaps it could be argued that a composer might create a new tune, perhaps. But certainly if I do a valuation report or write an essay, it's usually based on a whole lot of raw materials. A valuation report, for instance, includes lots and lots of data, observations, photographs, perhaps theory. They're all brought together into your report. And so your report is this crystallization of a lot of ideas. Many of those ideas come from other places, so you're using raw materials. You're not creating at all. You are producing. You are writing. And there are a number of words perhaps that you could use as synonyms to write, produce, make. But create is a very particular way to make something. It's when you make it out of absolutely nothing. We seldom do that as human beings, and so it's good to reserve that word for when it is truly applicable. It looks fancy perhaps, I'm not sure, but it certainly doesn't look educated. And in some ways you are diluting the quality of the English language by misusing its words. And there are a few other terms here. Generally, for professional and academic writing, it is preferable to use more established words and more transparent words than novel words, in other words, new words, or words which are less transparent. It's less obvious what the point is. You don't need to demonstrate your education by using words that nobody understands. You aim to communicate and educate your reader, which is very much what you're doing when you write a valuation report. You are educating your reader as to the value of a property, and so using certainly words that come from the educated end of your dictionary, but not ones which are opaque, that is, that they obscure as much as they communicate. And so using simple terms but in a way which reflects your education, because your education is quite different to the words you use. Educated people do have an expanded vocabulary, and I do recommend that you work on that as you go through your life, certainly while you're at university. But don't lose sleep using fancy words, if you like, as an exercise in pride, especially when they don't relate to the point, the idea that you're intending to communicate.